Hi, today we're going to talk about cultural and ethical relativism. These are two related theories, one with a descriptive aspect and one with a normative aspect. So we'll separate those two out and we'll talk a little bit about why relativism is something that ethicists need to deal with before they go on to put forth their own moral theories. So in relativism, what we're really thinking about is whether morality is just a matter of what your culture determines or maybe even what a smaller group that with which you associate determine. So when we think about whether morality is relative, this is a pretty popular view expressed by a lot of college students and others, and it's basically the idea that, hey, what's right for me might not be right for you. Who am I to judge? I'm not really comfortable putting forth ideas about morality that should apply to everyone because we all have our differences. So this is a very tolerant view, and we can think of lots and lots of examples, like in the image illustrated here, where we look at another culture and we're inclined to judge them. And we're really just looking at sort of different standards that have arisen within the traditions and customs of that society. So we're going to explore that a little bit today and see whether the observation that different cultures have different practices and different standards means that we can never judge another culture or another society's. Okay, so with cultural relativism, what we're talking about here is a descriptive theory. It's just basically an observation that different cultures have different moral standards. So if you want to know whether you're looking at a descriptive or a normative statement, remember descriptive statements are is statements, we can look at the statement and ask ourselves if you know whether it's true or false, or if you don't know, how you could find out whether it's true or false. So with cultural relativism, the basic assertion that different cultures have different moral standards, we would know whether that was true by gathering evidence, right? We could get facts, and those facts would either support or refute this idea that different cultures do, in fact, have different moral standards. So this is something that we can hopefully all agree on, this description that different cultures do have these different standards. So this stance here is pretty uncontroversial. We haven't really talked about what we ought to do. We're just talking about the way things are. Ethical relativism is the next step, right? So most of the time when we're talking about relativism, we're not just talking about this basic observation. We're also talking about how we ought to respond to those facts. So in ethical relativism, this is a normative theory that has, you can see here, an ought statement in it. We ought to be tolerant of other cultures' moral standards when they do differ from our own. So if we want to know whether this is true, we can't just get that by gathering facts and information, right? We have to construct an argument supported by premises, leading us to the conclusion that the appropriate course of action is toleration and not judging other cultures. So now we're talking about an ethical standpoint, right? Not just a descriptive standpoint. And what we need to do is figure out what connects these two. We need to figure that out in order to know whether this observation of different cultures' moral standards requires us to always be tolerant of those differences, right? Or whether there might be some instances where we are allowed to judge. We're allowed to say one culture's moral standards are better than another's. Okay, so we're going to start with the statement that everybody can get on board with. That's the one of the signs of a good basic philosophical argument. You want your reader or your listener to be on board with you right away. Different cultures have different moral standards. Very few people are going to refute that idea. The next premise, there's no objective way to judge one as better than the other. In other words, there's no sort of impartial, non-culturally influenced standpoint from which we can say, I will impartially judge this culture as better or worse than that other one. We're all culturally limited by our own context, so we can't really achieve objectivity there. Our own moral code, therefore, doesn't have any special status. What that means is our culture's moral code is just one among many different options, and there's no reason why we should consider our culture's moral code, our set of rules for being morally good, as better or worse than anyone else's, right? They're all kind of the same. None is privileged over another. So this is going to lead us to the next point, that there therefore are no universal moral truths, no ideas that apply to everyone. So morality is determined by society's moral code, not by universal ethical rules. And that means that we ought to be tolerant of other cultures because we're all kind of in the same boat. We're all in this situation where we've inherited a moral code from our society. There aren't any ethical rules that ought to apply to everybody. And that means that no individual moral code from any society has any special status. That means that other cultures are just as valid as our own in terms of morality. So this is the basic argument for relativism. And if you look at these premises for a little bit, you might find a few that you would want to argue against, push back against, get a little more information about before you're willing to really go along with it. So the cultural differences argument says that because different cultures have different moral codes, there is no objective truth and morality. In other words, there's no single moral approach that applies across the board. So what we need to examine is whether the fact that people disagree means that every ethical assertion that people make is equally valid. Or maybe there are some tools that we can use to judge whether one's better or worse than another. So to do that, we need to look at some of the consequences of cultural relativism. So these are outlined in the reading, and I'm just going to go over them briefly here because this constitutes some of the main rebuttals of relativism. First, that we have to respect other societies' customs as equally valid. Now, on the face of it, this seems pretty good, right? Because as I said, we like tolerance. We like the idea that we're open to new ideas. And it's certainly a good thing that we don't automatically think that our own beliefs are superior. However, this also means that there are some customs that we might find distasteful or even wildly unethical that we would have to accept as equally valid under the idea of relativism. Practices like slavery, child soldiers, honor killings, or apartheid. So if we're truly going to be on board with relativism, we would have to say that a society that practices slavery, those moral standards are just as equally valid as our own in our society where we don't have slavery. So this is going to lead us to the question of how far we have to go with our toleration, whether we have to tolerate people that we consider actually morally evil, perhaps, like Hitler. Is this someone that we have to tolerate as just another example of an equally valid moral viewpoint? Another related consequence of cultural relativism is the notion that we really are kind of gotten off the hook in terms of thinking for ourselves and making any personal moral deliberations, right? If we wanted to know what to do in a given situation, all we would have to do is consult our society's moral standards and then make a decision that's consistent with that. So there's not a lot of actual thinking that's required, and you can imagine, based on what we did before with the basics of ethical argumentation, why that might be considered a problem by some philosophers. So there are a lot of different reasons why this might be problematic on a practical level as well. The notion of multiple cultural identities. Most of us consider ourselves to be members of more than one culture. You might disagree with your own society's moral standards, and we see that all the time. We saw that with the letter to the Birmingham jail, where Martin Luther King Jr. and others were certainly expressing disagreement with their society's moral standards. There might be disagreement present within a society, and what that means is that there might not be a clear majority opinion to refer to when you're trying to make your own moral decision. And then this would render us unable to criticize our own society because we wouldn't be able to claim to have moral superiority over the standard set of rules. So we can talk about that a little more with the notion of moral progress. So if we're going to accept cultural relativism to mean that there is no way to determine better or worse moral judgments, then that's going to mean that moral progress is impossible. So moral progress is just the idea that a society's values can improve, get better over time, specifically the notion of replacing a current practice or belief with a better one. So we see that in a lot of liberation movements and a lot of rights-based movements, like the civil rights movement in the U.S. that Martin Luther King Jr. was a part of. His letter from the Birmingham jail is a great example of someone stepping up and saying, this moral system is corrupt. We need a better one based on equality and justice, and we need to make moral progress by moving from this old set of social standards to a new set of social standards. If we're relativists, we wouldn't be able to say that. We wouldn't be able to evaluate one set of moral rules as better or worse than another, and therefore we wouldn't be able to call for moral progress, which by implication means improving, getting better over time. So movements like the civil rights movement, like the women's rights movement, things like that, we wouldn't be able to say are an example of society's moral code improving, because that would be using a value judgment. One thing to think about is whether the differences that we see in the way cultures express their values is a difference in morality or a difference in practice. So the author that you read for today claims that all cultures have some values in common. One example that he gives is the value of caring for the young. So he gets at that with the example of the Eskimos. He says that if you have certain values in society, those are going to help the society continue to survive. And without those values, that society would die out. So it's pretty easy to see that a society that didn't have a value of caring for infants and for the very young would soon lack a next generation to continue that society into the future. So what I want you to think about, and this is just one of those food for thought questions that we'll return to on upcoming exams, right? Those are things that I just want you to start mulling over now in preparation for thinking about it and writing about it on the midterm. What are some other rules that you can think of that all societies need to survive? So what I mean by that is not rules that you just think are good to have, but if you didn't have that rule, the society would probably die out, like this rule of caring for the young. And that might be expressed differently in different societies. So we have different practices, but similar values. So that's what Rachel's is really asking us to think about in this reading, right? He says what may seem like different values is just really oftentimes different ways to express those values, similar values. So if this is true, then when we look at cultural differences, we're not really looking at different moral codes. We're looking at different ways of expressing the same moral code within different societies. So I just want you to think about that. Does this make sense to you? Do you agree with that? And are there any examples that you can think of where we're not just talking about different expressions of values, but we're really talking about different values that are in place? I gave some examples earlier of things that seem egregiously different, like child soldiers and honor killings, slavery, apartheid. Is there any way we can make this fit into Rachel's idea that this is just different expressions of common moral values, or are these examples of things that are really different ethically? So we've seen some problems with cultural relativism. We know that it can have some uncomfortable implications. It would make moral progress impossible. It would require us to accept things as equally valid that we find very problematic. But there are some clear benefits as well. The main benefit is probably humility about our own morals, about what we always thought was good and right. So we know that we can't just rely on, well, that's what I've always been taught. We know that we have to provide reasons, premises to support what we think. And relativism is a great way to sort of force us to realize that we have inherited a lot of moral codes and moral rules that we may not necessarily have good reasons for. So it's really going to give us some humility about our own morals, and that's always good. And it's also going to create open-mindedness towards other views. Not necessarily always toleration, right? There might be some limits to how much we want to tolerate, and we're probably all going to draw that line in different places. But it is going to create open-mindedness. Now, cultural relativism, as I said, is not a moral theory. What I mean by that is that cultural relativism and its counterpart ethical relativism don't give us a real decision-making tool to use when we find ourselves in a moral dilemma. It's really a way of saying that there is no morality beyond what you happen to have inherited from your own culture. So it is very limiting in that way, and it's something that we want to think about whether we really want to embrace that moving forward. So most moral theories that we're going to be looking at will reject this view, and the philosophers that put forth moral theories, like John Stuart Mill, like Immanuel Kant, like Aristotle, and others, believe that they can, in fact, present a universal standard of morality that everyone ought to follow. That's all I've got, and I'll see you guys next time.